So we're going to talk about replacing the tube on an XPO Trainer or one of the original XPO Sleds front wheel. This is actually from one of the originals, but they're both very similar. In either case, when you have removed the wheel, and that's covered in a separate video, you need to completely remove at least one side of the axle nuts. So in this case, I'm going to remove that one. At this point, before you disassemble it any further, take a picture, note the order of spacers and the order in which everything goes, the chain tensioners, the orientation, which way that chain tensioner is facing. So in this case, it's facing inwards as opposed to outwards, and that will be consistent between the XPO Trainer and the XPO Sled. But get a picture of all this so you know how to put it back together. When you pull this side out, just to kind of stack the deck in your favor, don't let any of those spacers come off, and that way you know that that will just go back in the way it was. The next thing is, if you're replacing the tube, you won't need to let the air out, I assume, because the tire is flat. That's why you're replacing it. You may just be replacing the tire though, in which case the tube is fine, but the tire has worn down to the point that you need to replace it. Most important thing is get something and make sure you've let all of the air out of that tube before you take the wheel apart. If you start taking the wheel apart while there's still air pressure in there, it's going to try and force it apart and you could get injured. So give the tire a squeeze, make sure you have all that air out. Now you should be able to start taking this apart. On the original and on the XPO Trainer, the 3 bolts that hold this wheel together use a 5mm Allen wrench. So get whatever Allen wrench you need. Break those loose. And then remove these all the way. Set those 3 bolts aside, and now this half of the wheel should come right off. There's a couple of things to notice here. The first one is there is a spacer inside the wheel. The spacer holds the bearings apart, and it's critical that it go back in. I set it right there. Second part is there is a cutout in each half of the wheel for the valve stem to come through. So we're going to leave this one down. We're going to set this to the side, and then I'm going to pull the wheel off that. At that point, we can just leave that there for a moment. The valve stem is a good way to grab a hold of the tire, and you just want to pull the tire all the way out. If you're replacing the tube all the way out, if you're replacing the tube, that will come out easily. Here's a replacement tube. The replacement tube should be totally flat so that it can get in to the tire easily. Now we want to push this down, but we want this valve stem to line up with that groove. So we're going to push it down just like that. That's going to be the way that's going to go back together. At this point, you can very carefully add a little bit of air. If you look, this tube, it's easy to get this tube caught between the 2 halves of the wheel, but if I add a tiny bit of air, and I really mean a tiny bit, that's usually just enough to push everything out of the way so that you can see the other wheel half can go on. So all that's pushed out of the way. It's critical you put the spacer back in. The second wheel half will go again with this notch lining up with the valve stem. At this point, you can drop in the bolts for the wheel halves, and you may have to wiggle these around a little bit to get them to all line up. Okay, before you tighten these bolts down completely, slide the axle back through and just let it go through completely. And what that does is it makes sure that the spacer inside is lined up. If you tighten these wheel halves and it pinches that spacer, you won't be able to get the axle through. So with the axle all the way through the wheel, you can now tighten each of these down. Obviously, the closer you get it before you drop the axle in, the less you'll be dealing with the difficulty of it. And try, when you tighten these, try to hold on to the wheel as much as possible. If you hold on to the tire, the rim can rotate, and your valve stem won't line up. And I'll show that in a moment so you can see what you need to do if that is the case. Okay, so if I hold on to the tire right here, you can see the rim can now rotate. And sometimes that will result in the valve stem being pushed one way or the other. You just want to grab the wheel and move it and the tire until you get that valve stem straight again. Make sure all your bolts are tight. Finally, make sure that the wheel spins freely on the axle. If that spacer did get pinched in there, you might need to loosen the bolts, wiggle it around and tighten them again, but usually it should be fine. At this point, it's fine for you to add air to it. So, I'll go ahead and do that. Some anyway. Once you have the tire inflated to 45 psi, and try not to overinflate it because it could rupture this rim, make sure that your axle is fine, make sure all that works good. Using the pictures you took earlier so that you know what spacers go where, replace whatever spacers or washers are on your model. Make sure that you have the chain tensioner oriented the same way it was when it came off. They should all be oriented where this bend is facing in towards the tire, and it should be doing that on both sides. This one is incorrect. And now you've refurbished this wheel and you're ready to put it back on the XPO. That's covered in a separate video for replacing the wheel and aligning it, and go check out that video now.